The gravity of the time is such that every new avenue of peace, no matter how dimly discernible, should be explored. Never before in history has so much hope for so many people been gathered together in a single organization. You will provide a great share of the wisdom, of the courage, and the faith which can bring to this world lasting peace for all nations and happiness and well-being for all men.
Welcome to Titans of Nuclear. Today we have Bhavia Lal with us. She's the Associate Administrator for Technology, Policy, and Strategy at NASA. Bhavia, it is so exciting to have you on the podcast to talk about space nuclear. Welcome to the show.
I'm so excited to be here, Michelle. Great talking to you. And again, we just found out that we know each other from way back when, so that's even better.
We do. Yeah, lots of history, but I'm actually really keen to start even before you and I met, I guess about 8 years ago now. But if you could kind of tell me, where did you grow up? What's your educational background? How did you get into science?
Great question, Michelle. I was born in a small town called Mathura, which is near Taj Mahal in India. I grew up in a pretty STEM-heavy family. My father was an electrical engineer. My mom studied math in college, but she got married at 19 and didn't ever have a chance to have a career. So her dream got channeled into me. My father traveled a lot, setting up sort of power plants and manufacturing units all over India. Until I was in high school, my mom and I traveled with him, sometimes for weeks and months. My mom would get the curriculum from my teachers and we would study. So I got a lot of homeschooling till I was in high school.
Wow.
And I arrived in the US as an 18-year-old. 2 suitcases full of books. It didn't occur to me to pack any clothes, and a dream to study nuclear physics and get a Nobel Prize. So you can imagine coming to MIT was a rude awakening. Just to round out the question, so I was part of the MIT 5-year bachelor's master's program in which I did I studied nuclear engineering. So full circle now.
What sparked that interest in nuclear? I mean, you said that you traveled around to see power plants in India with your dad as a child. Was that kind of the interest in energy, and why nuclear? How did you hear about it?
So I think at the time, climate change was something we had only started to hear about. You read about it in textbooks. So when I came to MIT thinking about the different options, it seemed like nuclear engineering was nuclear power was a good way to think about the future, and kind of that's where I started. Although over time, I think one thing I learned was the reason we weren't getting things done, building more nuclear power plants, for example, it wasn't because technology was lacking, but because there was a lack of policy, and policy is hard. I have a friend, Adam Russell, who always says, if you think physics is hard, imagine electrons can think and can be irrational. Now that's policy. And again, I mean, climate change is a representative example. Our challenges aren't engineering, but policy ones. And I think over time, I felt that doing things in space solves so many problems that we have on Earth, climate change, again, sticking with that theme being one. So I decided to focus on space. And that's where I am now at NASA.
Fantastic. Yeah. So, I mean, you definitely took on the challenge of thinking not just about the science, but communicating that science and that scientific understanding to the people who are trying to make those, very tough decisions moving into policy. I know before you started at NASA, you worked really closely across, multiple administrations at the Science and Technology Policy Institute and forming science policy with the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where you, really were quite a rock star in this space policy world of helping kind of bridge that gap between the technology, the cutting edge science, and then what do we actually do with that? And how do we ensure that we have policies that enable new science, but also think about how we can actually use the existing technology that we have to meet, large, governmental and American, countrywide goals and ambitions, but also planetary, which is really what your focus has been. So, after SIPI, you're now at NASA. Tell me about what it's been like to start out your career and to be at NASA for the past few years. What are you focusing on?
So my training is in policy analysis methods, and I found that these methods that I applied so well in the realm of science policy, R&D policy, where we work together, I found that the space sector hasn't really been as policy savvy because it was so strategic for geopolitical reasons. Analysis wasn't as core to space activities as it had been in other parts of the science community. So one of the things that happened when I switched to the space sector was all these methods that I'd learned both in school and in my career were highly applicable. So, for example, I initially did an analysis of whether a private space station would be profitable, and how you set up the model, how you do that analysis is something I felt very comfortable with, but it was a new way of thinking in the space sector. So since analysis was my jam, it was an easy switch to come from science policy to space policy. And today, I am the Associate Administrator for Technology Policy and Strategy at NASA. I report to our Deputy Administrator, and I kind of think about holistic things, big picture things at NASA, the directions in which NASA should move, areas where NASA should get involved, where it may not have been in the past, policy issues. When we get to the moon, there is 20 missions planned. There would be Chinese missions, commercial missions. How do we work together on the moon where there's no rules at all? So those are some of the things we think about in this new office that I lead.
So, okay, so yeah, great. It's a new office. I'd love to get to better understand that exact office function. But maybe, you are on Titans of Nuclear. Majority of our audience thinks about nuclear when it comes to, big commercial reactors or SMRs, terrestrial applications. Can you kind of talk to me about maybe a history of NASA and how nuclear has fit into, NASA's remit throughout the past few years, so we can really understand what you were just getting at?
Absolutely. So NASA actually has been part of nuclear efforts since its inception. And when we talk about nuclear, we are not just talking about fission reactors, which is something we see, terrestrially, but also what are called radioisotopic systems, which are basically a battery, essentially, which is powered by plutonium-238. And it can also be powered by other isotopes, but mostly it has been plutonium-238. So those are the two systems that NASA has been part of since its very creation. In fact, this month, nearly 60 years ago, the Atomic Energy Commission supervised the actual launch of a nuclear reactor in I think 1965. It produced about 500 watts of power. It was called SNAP-10A. And after working for a few weeks, it was shut down. So reactors have been part of our DNA from the beginning, although after that launch, we haven't had one again. And we should get into that a little bit. Mostly what NASA has done is flown these radioisotope systems. I think we've flown more than 3 or 4 dozen. Plutonium-238 has been used in nearly every NASA mission that required power. So, Apollo flights, Viking 1 and 2, the Mars landers, Voyager, the New Horizons mission to Pluto, and most recently the Mars Perseverance rover. Next up, we will launch a Dragonfly mission in 2027 to explore Saturn's largest moon, which we arrive in 2034. So today NASA is investing in all nuclear technologies across the board. We are looking at new ideas in radioisotope systems, systems that convert heat to power more efficiently. We are investing in power systems. Basically, just like on Earth, we have reactors. We would like to have power reactors in space, and we can talk about why. And then also nuclear power for what's called propulsion, to to travel across space.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's been an exciting time.
That's, I mean, it's actually really fascinating because you're, I mean, you're getting at the main uses of nuclear, right, on land. So for electrification purposes, maybe on the very small scale, the thought of kind of a nuclear battery makes a lot of sense. For larger scale applications, right, you think about larger SMRs or gigawatt scale plants that power cities, power communities, power factories. And then for propulsion, really just the equivalent of a car or any other form of transportation, except here, we're talking about traveling to Mars or to Saturn, which is on a completely different scale. So that's really fascinating that all aspects, have been not only part of NASA's history, but are also, having such focus on these new innovations within your office. I'd love to dig in on, around kind of the types of technologies that you're using. I mean, you mentioned plutonium 235 for the for traditional radioisotope battery packs, as you kind of define them. What other types of radioisotope power systems or other power systems are you all looking at? And then maybe you'd also like to explain a little bit more about how nuclear thermal propulsion technology works and what that really means.
Right. So plutonium-238 is a power source of radioisotope systems. This is basically a hot rock, right? It's once it's there, it just there is alpha particles that are emitted. They convert it into electricity. Easy peasy. Well, I'm obviously exaggerating. It's actually very complicated, and we take safety very, very seriously at NASA. But that's just one piece, right? The investments we are making now, and we have made them in the past as well, but there have been a lot of starts and stops. So you mentioned nuclear thermal propulsion, or nuclear NTP, or nuclear thermal rockets NTR. What nuclear thermal propulsion systems do is they utilize the heat from a fissioning nuclear reactor, basically the chain reaction, to heat and pressurize the liquid rocket propellant, which an example is hydrogen, from a liquid to a gas phase, and then the gaseous propellant is accelerated out a nozzle in the exact same way a conventional chemical rocket engine does. And basically the main difference is that chemical rockets have a combustion chamber where heat is generated via chemical reactions, whereas in nuclear you just heat the propellant directly. So it just in some ways simplifies things. There is another approach to nuclear propulsion in space, which is called nuclear electric propulsion, or NEP, which is actually very similar to a terrestrial reactor in that it basically converts thermal energy from that reactor fission reactor chamber into electrical energy, and that electrical energy is then powers electric thrusters that propel the spacecraft forward. So in all cases, it is Newton's third law, action and reaction, that's an action, but it's just slightly different approaches. And currently, NASA is investing mostly in NTP, nuclear thermal propulsion, but we are investing a little bit in NEP as well.
And so for both NTP and NEP, what is the base radioisotope that you're using, or is it still plutonium, or using uranium, or using something like strontium? What's the base?
Great question. We actually use uranium, and it in the olden days. So as I said, remember I said in 1965 we had launched a nuclear reactor. At the time we had used highly enriched, it's basically what might be considered weapons grade enriched uranium-235. Today, what we are trying to do is we are using low enriched uranium, or to be more precise, high assay low enriched uranium, HALEU it's called, which is about 19-ish% enrichment. So we have reduced enrichment levels, and the reason for that is we want to address the issue of proliferation in space. We don't want the nuclear fuel that would be in a reactor to, for example, get stolen and turned into a weapon. So we are trying to make our reactors more secure.
Yes.
And again, I'm making a distinction here between safety and security. The low enriched uranium isn't about safety and making them more safe. It's about making them more secure.
Yeah, absolutely, for non-proliferation reasons. So that's for the propulsion ones. And then in terms of fuel sources, are you also exploring, alternative radioisotopes for, kind of the battery pack version or the terrestrial? I guess, I guess maybe I might also be exploring HALEU for moon terrestrial applications. I don't really know what you call that. If there is a term of art for base moon base applications.
Again, great questions, Michelle. So for radioisotope systems, government systems have always used or mostly used plutonium-238, at least for space applications. But there is this emerging private sector that is proposing the use of isotopes other than plutonium-238. One reason is plutonium-238 is susceptible to proliferation. It is also very expensive to produce. It is only produced in government labs. So it's not, so we really do have a limited supply of radioisotope systems. So these commercial companies like USNC or Xenopower are coming up with a variety of other isotopes that they believe can be useful. And of course, a lot of these things are being, are emerging, right? We don't know if they will work, but we are super excited. And again, I'm a huge supporter of commercial activities in space. So I'm highly supportive of us, very carefully looking at what these companies are doing and seeing how we can integrate them in our plans. So that's RPS. On nuclear power on the moon, that's just a reactor on Earth. Again, we are looking at high HALEU, high assay LEU systems, similar to the propulsion system. Mm-hmm. So no difference between fission power and fission propulsion with respect to the fuel source.
Fantastic. So it sounds like there's a lot of innovation happening, obviously, both within, government and policy space, but also even in the commercial space. So how is all of that innovation around these new technologies changing, how you guys are thinking about future travel and missions that NASA is conducting?
So again, really excellent question, Michelle. What nuclear does, so let's split up power and propulsion separately, right? So what nuclear does is it helps when there's enough solar flux available. So for example, on Mars or in a lunar crater, or when the environment is so chemically or from a radiation perspective corrosive that it may corrode solar panels. Mm-hmm. Or when we need power for an extended length of time, getting to Pluto with New Horizons took 9 years. So you kind of batteries run in that kind of time. So that's kind of the sweet spot of nuclear power.
It's that reliability, longevity. Yeah, that's
right. So again, just giving the example of Mars. Mars is 1.6 times farther away from the sun than we are, which means there is 50 to 60% less solar flux on the surface of Mars than in Earth orbit. So just from that perspective, solar power is simply not a realistic option on Mars, especially if you need reliable sources of power to support humans who are there. That doesn't shut off because a dust storm covered the solar panels. I don't know if you saw that movie, Oppie, Goodnight Oppie, which kind of talked about the Opportunity rover, which basically once it was covered with dust, it was unable to function. And as you know, Mars has these months-long dust storms, and the day and night cycle also makes solar power less reliable. And then there's that challenge of size because of the lower flux. A solar panel so the solar panel on the space station, which your listeners might know about, spans a football field. To produce that same level of power would require solar panels that are 2 football fields on Mars under the best of conditions, and maybe 5 football fields if we account for dust storms. And given that we need basically 7 kilograms of propellant to transport 1 kilogram of usable payload to Mars, imagine the cost of that transportation, this will be a nearly impossible feat. So nuclear power is essential for any kind of sustainable presence, whether human or robotic, on Mars. So that's just on the power front. I mean, there's the propulsion front as well, right? Mars is so far away. The journey is wrought with peril. There's radiation, there's lack of gravity, there's loneliness. We want to get there fast. So if we just use chemical propulsion, it'll take 1,100 days, about half of which is travel time. With nuclear propulsion, the travel time could be cut by 30% or more. So So it is just really important for us to look at these alternative sources of both power and propulsion as we go deeper into space.
Yeah, I mean it all makes complete sense, and it's really fascinating. I think the payload restrictions and requirements, and also thinking about these harsh environments, is something that, you know, we see the same sorts of challenges, right, when we're thinking about decarbonizing places that might not have great natural resource for geothermal, for hydropower, or for solar and wind. And nuclear always kind of seems to be that one key technology that, you know, just doesn't really have those same you know, challenges based on geography, or resource constraint. But then, of course, I think the scale, as you described it, is also so critical because, as you said, you know, in an ideal world, sure, we could just put whatever we want on Mars, but you have to get there. And you have to really plan out, I mean, quite literally every single aspect of all of these missions. And nuclear seems like a really critical piece of kind of enabling that next generation of, you know, more advanced missions and more advanced planning. So that's all great, but I'm sure there are so many challenges that you think about on a daily basis, not just with meeting all those objectives, but also with the nuclear technology itself. I mean, this is technology that's primarily, you know, been developed for terrestrial applications. It's been used, you know, in certain systems like Voyager, and some of the others that you mentioned in the past. But, you know, we haven't really fully relied on it to the point where, you know, some of those space cowboy movies that we all watch are actually true. So what are some of the challenges that you foresee and the NASA foresees, in, you know, really relying more on nuclear technology to help enable, you know, our goals in space?
So there's obviously technical challenges. Both nuclear thermal propulsion and nuclear electric propulsion have challenges. So for example, for NTP, the reactor system must heat the propellant to at least 2700 Kelvin. Reactor materials must be protected against hot hydrogen attack. We need to store liquid hydrogen in basically 0 degree, absolute zero space, and with minimal losses in deep space. We need to be cresting. I mean, so there's a huge list of technical issues both with NEP and NTP. And there was a National Academy of Science report written in 2021 that really laid the challenges out. But in my view, and again, I have the NASA technology policy and strategy hat on right now, the main impediment is not technological. It's that there is no demand pull, and therefore it is underfunded. The lack of demand basically inhibits investments, and if you have no investment, users are worried about saying this is something that we want. So I think one of the ways to kind of stop this vicious cycle is for either our exploration systems directorate, or even outside of NASA, a user saying, I want this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to unpack some of that. I mean, now you're tickling the part of my brain that really lights up. So, obviously, NASA is, the premier space agency that everyone thinks of. They think of U.S. government and space. They think of NASA, but it's not just NASA that operates assets and has, missions and objectives in space. I mean, there's NOAA, there's even USGS. I mean, there's I think 17 agencies that have some role in something that I'm sure NASA supports. So could you kind of talk to me though about how funding works though, because NASA really is kind of the critical agency in all of our space applications. So what other agencies are working in space nuclear, or is it only NASA? And then within NASA's budget, I'd love to unpack, how much of that actually goes to to your office, but really more to enable kind of the nuclear technology within NASA's budget.
NASA is not the only government agency investing in space, which is just wonderful. DARPA, which is part of the Department of Defense, has a program called DRACO. It stands for, I think, Demonstration Rocket for Agile Cislunar Operations. So the DRACO program is a collaboration. They're collaborating with NASA to build a nuclear thermal rocket, NTP system, that could, that is of use to both of our agencies. And their goal is to test a nuclear thermal rocket-enabled spacecraft in Earth orbit during the 2027 fiscal year. So that's just DARPA. AFRL, the Air Force Research Laboratories, is investing in a program called JETSON, which is, I think, short for Joint Energy Supplying On-Orbit Nuclear Power. And again, their focus is on producing power in space. There's another DoD entity called Defense Innovation Unit, DIU, and they are looking at chargeable encapsulated radioisotope batteries for both propulsion and power. So there's really good investment across the board. With respect to funding, I am not sure. I should speak to funding in other agencies, but Congress appropriates NASA about $110 million annually to focus on nuclear thermal propulsion NTP systems. That funding goes to our Space Technology Mission Directorate, STMD. In fact, all of this, the nuclear work happens within STMD. And a set of NASA centers. So we have a center in Alabama called a Marshall Space Flight Center, where a lot of the work gets done. And obviously, we have contractors who are all over the country who work in this area. So it isn't, the work isn't just happening within NASA, but it's happening, in industry as well, in companies like Aerojet Rocketdyne, BWXT, General Atomics, USNC, and Blue Origin, and others are getting this government funding across the board to do some of this work. It's a very exciting time to be in the space nuclear community.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, are there, I know, we all, I'm sure a lot of people think about, SpaceX as kind of a premier example of how public-private partnerships with NASA and space have worked out. But could you kind of unpack some of the other types of, private sector investments that we see in this space? So there's obviously funding coming from government, but how is the private sector really being involved in terms of helping to either provide investment and funding, but also in terms of helping to create that demand that you're talking about?
So I just want to clarify that the private sector has always supported government investment in space nuclear, but exclusively in a contracting role, right? So for example, for the Perseverance rover that landed on Mars in 2021, the Department of Energy procured the system, the RTG, the radioisotope system, from Aerojet Rocketdyne, SunPower, and a company called Teledyne Energy Systems. NASA contracted with a company called ULA, United Launch Alliance, to provide launch services. So the private sector has always been there. However, in recent years, we have seen private investment in space. I mentioned some of these companies, right? USNC, there's a new company called Dark Vision. You mentioned Xenopower earlier. And there's venture funding in this area. Many of these companies are interested in doing things on the moon. They understand that if you want to extract resources from the moon, for example, there's need for power that goes beyond solar and chemical batteries. And they're actually hoping that they would have customers that aren't just NASA or the government, but also other private companies that want to, for example, do some of this extraction. So there's a lot of excitement about creating a cislunar economy and creating this infrastructure, whether it's power, it's propulsion, it's communications, it's sort of this backbone we need to build in space, so we can start to and again, using the parlance of the internet, build apps on top of this infrastructure.
That's great.
And there's a lot of excitement in the community that we have tried for many years to create a private space sector, but I think finally we are starting to get one. And you mentioned some of the companies that are putting some of those pieces together, and then again, these companies like USNC and Dark Vision hopefully will be able to provide the power that both the government and the private sector can purchase.
That's fantastic. So, you also earlier mentioned, it's not just NASA and American companies thinking about space. It's other countries. It's essentially the whole world. And so that, means from the policy standpoint, from the regulatory standpoint, from the diplomatic standpoint, this is a pretty tricky thing to really think through and ensure that we have all the right agreements and processes in place to ensure that worries of this kind of becoming space is a free for all, right? I mentioned the cowboys earlier, right? But some of those some of those aren't too hard to imagine if we don't have really good solid policy and understanding and cooperation amongst nations who are active in space and are looking at the moon, Mars, beyond, but also in terms of, as you said, resource extraction, powering potential human or robot civilizations on those places. So how do you think about these kind of regulatory and international cooperation challenges?
So on a regulation perspective, there's actually a national policy. It just came out in 2020.
Oh,
It's there's a memorandum called the National Security Presidential Memorandum 20. Government bureaucracy. It specifically provides guidance on how to make sure that nuclear systems are safe to launch, and it has a three-tiered system based on, and each of them has a different approach to or different level of controls, and those depend on the system, the level of hazard, and national security considerations.
hmm
And there is a national environmental NEPA implementation to this policy. There is a very rigorous risk informed safety analysis that needs to be done, and it needs to be reviewed by interagency nuclear safety review board. So a lot of guardrails, you could say, that are in place to make sure that we will launch nuclear systems safely. Um, there's still a lot more to be done. I mean, we haven't launched one in more than in almost 60 years, at least a fission system, right? So, there has been some concern about, what's called regulatory uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
And so we just need to, and which is why I'm really excited about the Draco test, because that will be the first time I think we will be testing some of these new policies that we've put in place. Um, and I think having clarity of regulatory clarity would actually help even more private investment. On the international front, you asked, there's a lot of international treaties the United States is party to, and most of them have some reference to space nuclear systems. So, for example, the United States is liable for any damage caused by space objects that they launch.
Mm-hmm.
So, if there's any damage that we cause, to another asset in space, that's something we need to be thinking about. The United States is required to authorize and supervise non-government activities in space
Mm.
and maintain what's called control and jurisdiction over that object. This is something actually that we don't have, and we are working on, and it's really important for the government to have legal authority over the private sector working in space.
Yeah.
The only United Nations principle or guidance is this thing called UN Resolution 4768, which basically lays out 11 principles related to safely operating nuclear systems in space. So not a whole lot of guidance, but all the important one is in place.
Yeah, no, I mean, it really is so critical, right? I mean, I think what's so interesting is we have what sounds like at least a clear pathway. I think that's okay language, right? Towards how we think about regulation, ensuring safety, ensuring non-proliferation, of American assets and American private sector and American public sector, activities in space. And we're getting there, I think, it sounds like on the international front, but it definitely, to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, sounds like NASA and the United States government is really leading the way in many ways, in terms of how we kind of set the initial ground rules, for, what activities nations should be liable for, and in what areas nations should cooperate to ensure peaceful uses of space, but also peaceful uses of nuclear power in space. So that's incredibly critical. Is your office directly involved at kind of the UN level, those international working groups or talks?
So my office is about providing advice to our leadership. So to the extent that our leaders speak at the UN, we get to make a contribution to that. So yes, actually, I was last week I was giving a keynote, not in nuclear, but at the planetary defense, in the area of a different area, planetary defense, which actually does have some nuclear implications. which was a UN conference. And in the past, we've presented at UN USA, the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs. So we get to participate in some of these discussions, and it is very clear that the whole world is looking for leadership from the United States, whether it's just pushing the frontiers of technology or laying out guidelines for safety, or in general creating inspiration for spreading out into the solar system, which is something that all of us at NASA are so excited about.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I mean, I think that is a good segue into a question that I always love to ask people on this podcast, which is kind of, you personally, like now it sounds like your career has just been absolutely kind of leading up to this point, and now you're really, a central figure in terms of thinking through, how we as a civilization will act in space and how we utilize this type of technology in space. When you think about kind of the future of nuclear power as it applies to space, what is your vision?
So let me give you a high level vision and then go specifically to nuclear. So at the highest level, I like to quote Carl Sagan, and he basically said, every planetary civilization is obliged to become spacefaring, not because of exploratory or romantic zeal, but for the most practical reason imaginable, staying alive. We have a basic responsibility to our species to venture to other worlds. So kind of, that is a big picture vision, which is the elephant-sized vision, and how to eat an elephant one bite at a time. And so my bite is to work with space nuclear power, because in the long term, it is, we have no alternative as we get farther away from the sun, as we need to travel faster. We need nuclear power. And one thing that is very exciting to me, and we've touched on it a little bit, is it used to be that the government was the only game in town, but with a growing commercial sector, I think there's just going to be more players, a growing international sector. I think there will be more of us working towards it, which is very exciting. And we have to take a lot of lessons from terrestrial systems. So terrestrial power in the United States is entirely commercial. Terrestrial power in the United States is an international supply chain. Mm-hmm. And there is no reason why space nuclear shouldn't also be the same. So that's kind of my vision for the future of space nuclear.
I love that. So I guess kind of as you think about, the outlooks, the missions that you're supporting, the project you're supporting, what is particularly intriguing to you that's kind of coming down the pipeline that you're looking forward to being a part of?
So I think, and I pointed to it before, Michelle, but I think it's worth underscoring that our challenges aren't in new emerging technologies. Our challenges really are strategic, and they are about growing the pie. And I think that's where we need to put our effort. We need to have an end goal. We need to say, this is when we want to go to Mars. This is how long we want to take to get to Mars, because that will help define which specific nuclear technology we focus on, whether it's NTP or NEP or a combination of NEP and chemical, or chemical alone, right? So that will help us with direction. And again, on the strategic piece, making sure that we collaborate with our international partners. There is growing interest in investing in space nuclear in the United Kingdom, the UK Space Agency, the French Space Agency. I think these are our traditional partners in other parts of space, for example, the International Space Station. And it would be great if we work together with these partners in the domain of space nuclear as well. So those are some of the things where I think we are going to be focusing on, and that's where I'm putting some of my efforts in.
Fantastic. All right. So I guess I'll ask you the last question we always do, which gives you the floor. Are there any kind of key messages that you'd like to share with our listeners about nuclear?
So I think in the past, I started by saying, we launched the first reactor in 1965. Since then, we've had a dozen efforts where we started and stopped investing in nuclear power. We may have spent $20 billion in this area. But I think we finally have all the pieces in place. We have a mission. We have technologies in a good place. We have a way of proceeding in a secure way with low enriched uranium, something that we couldn't do before. So we have policy now in place. We have congressional interest. We have commercial interest. I think all the the blocks are put together nicely. And I'm just very excited and very optimistic that this time around we are on a great positive track, and we are going to get our mission, whether it's first with Draco for the first test of a space nuclear reactor, and after that building prototypes that go to Mars. So that's my message for your listeners, and I hope they stay connected with us to see what we are doing and how we are doing it. And we want all of us to go together.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Bhavia. It's been fantastic to have you on Titans. A real pleasure and honor for me personally. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. And again, remember, Dragonfly going to Titan in 2026. So we are connected.
Well, I'll be watching. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, Bhavia.
Of course.
And initiate at least a new approach to the many difficult problems that must be solved in both private and public conversation if the world is to shake off the inertia imposed by fear and is to make positive progress toward peace.